I'm Dr. Joshua Reichard, President and CEO of Omega Graduate School, and this is an overview of sociological theories. Sociologists have come to embrace what C. Wright Mills called the sociological imagination. And for Mills, there were essentially four components to developing a sociological imagination. That is, seeing the world, seeing the problems and the people around us through the eyes of the discipline of sociology. First, we must see a link between individual and society. That is, there's a relationship, a dynamic interaction between our individual experiences and larger social forces that are at work all around us. Second, there's a distinction between our personal troubles and public issues. Social problems are greater than the sum of their parts. In other words, all problems don't boil down to individual responsibility or individual concerns or individual struggles. At some level, all of those individual struggles aggregate and become social problems that are larger than the sum of their parts. Number three, historical context. As sociologists, we understand that societal issues must be understood within their broader historical context. Social problems and social forces didn't just develop overnight. Sometimes they're as old as human civilization. And tracing the root causes or the systemic causes of those problems is beneficial to understanding them. And finally, critical thinking. Social issues should be researched and examined using social science methodology. Social activism is not enough. Let's first look at structural functionalism, which is most often associated with the father of modern sociology, Emil Durkheim. Structural functionalism views society as a complex system whose parts work together to ultimately and hopefully produce social stability and social solidarity, what some call equilibrium. That is, trying to find a balance in society, perhaps between poverty and wealth, or between the working class and a capitalist class, or between government and freedom. The key to structural functionalism is identifying dysfunctional elements in society. That is, whatever causes social dysfunction or disruption or disequilibrium. And the ultimate goal is to try to understand what we can do as sociologists to promote social stability. So from a structural functionalist perspective, revolution or movements that advocate for upending certain social structures might not be the goal. The goal instead is to try to maintain stability and social equilibrium. Conflict or critical theory is most often associated with Karl Marx. It's perhaps the most misunderstood of all of the theories. Conflict theory focuses on the social struggles between different groups and the inequality in the distribution of resources and power. For Marx, this inequality was grounded in the economic inequality between the proletariat, the working class, and the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, during the Industrial Revolution. And without a question, there were injustices. The conditions for working people in industrial era factories were abhorrent. There were no child labor laws, and people were exploited for their labor. For Marx, the solution was the proletariat taking back what he called the means of production. And for Marx, that was humanizing. So today, conflict or critical theory focuses on exposing inequalities in society, identifying areas where social change is necessary to address injustices and imbalances. And the ultimate goal, unlike structural functionalism, might not be equilibrium, but instead revolution. So for Marxism, the key is empowering disadvantaged groups, challenging existing power structures, and advocating for social justice. Unlike structural functionalism and critical or conflict theory, symbolic interactionism is a more benign approach to sociological methodology or sociological theory. Symbolic interactionism emphasizes the role of symbols and language as core elements of all human interaction. In other words, we use symbols and we agree on the meaning behind certain symbols in order for society to function. An example of this are the lines on the roads. A solid line in the United States means no passing. A dotted line means that a car can pass. And by and large, we agree on those symbols and respect them. So a sociologist might use symbolic interactionism to interpret social interactions. We want to understand how individual and group behaviors shape perceptions. The focus here is on meaning making. Symbolic interactionists look for the meanings that we ascribe to everyday interactions and how those meanings shape people's experiences and actions, particularly in the collective or regarding group behavior more so than at the individual level. Social constructionism is associated with Peter Berger and is similar to symbolic interactionism. Social constructionism argues that knowledge and many aspects of the world around us are not discovered, but constructed by societies through our language and communication. In other words, there's not necessarily any transcendent meaning in the symbols or the language that we use. Rather, those things are socially constructed by the societies who agree to them. Social constructionism is used to understand social perceptions. And some of the work in social constructionism is actually deconstructing to understand how certain ideas, meanings, symbols, and perceptions and norms have been constructed in the first place. Ultimately, social constructionists want to seek context. They want to consider the socially constructed nature of issues to address problems in ways that are sensitive to the context and perceptions of a target culture or community. Finally, postmodernism is a bit more of a rebel theory in that it suggests that all social reality is diverse, pluralistic, and constantly in flux, and it is shaped by discourse, decentralization, and ambiguity. The key word in postmodernism is deconstruction. That is, challenging traditional social structures and dismantling social norms. The key argument for theorists such as Jacques Derrida is that social norms are put in place by those in power, and therefore they should be torn down or deconstructed to empower those who have no power. However, there's an epistemological component to postmodernism. In fact, some may argue that all of postmodern theory is ultimately epistemological in nature. And of course, by epistemology, I mean the nature of knowledge itself. The idea here is that truth is relative. Truth depends on individual perspectives and societal constructs. And if social constructs or social norms are simply constructed by those who are in power, then why should we believe them, especially for those who are disempowered? So the tradition of postmodernism has been to challenge what we think we know. And it has affected more than just the field of sociology. It has questioned the nature of science and the scientific method, which has been emulated by the social sciences. However, postmodernism is not all bad. In some ways, it's work of deconstruction, much like Marxism, is a necessary component in sociology itself because it provides some tools and resources for critiquing social structures that deservedly need to be critiqued. The ultimate questions come when applying these epistemological questions about the relativity of truth or the nature of knowledge. I would be remiss if I didn't mention some of the diverse voices in sociological theory throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. Dorothy Smith is known as the mother of feminism, which is, in her case, an example of social constructionism. Dorothy Smith was a Canadian sociologist with major contributions in feminist sociology. She's known for developing the concept of standpoint theory, which emphasizes the perspectives of women in a male-dominated society. Patricia Hill Collins is also known for contributions to feminism, particularly through the lens of critical theory. Dr. Collins is an American sociologist recognized for her work in the areas of race, gender, social class, sexuality, and nationality, what sociologists often call intersectionality. She's well known for her contributions to the field of feminist theory and her book, Black Feminist Thought. Now let's do the heavy lifting. We're going to examine these sociological theories through their own lenses and then through the lens of a Christian critique or a Christian integration. Structural functionalism looks at social problems through the lens of what disrupts social stability and social order. From a Christian perspective, we would agree that order is certainly better than chaos, but we also acknowledge that our present social order is, and in its current state, always will be broken. Because the final order is eschatological in nature. That is, it's a future coming kingdom. And that future coming kingdom, or our vision of the future coming kingdom, is what we can use to critique the present. Conflict or critical theory views social problems through the lens of every problem being rooted in power struggles and inequalities. Now, from a Christian perspective, we certainly agree that injustice and oppression are sinful. But we also have a sober view of human nature, and we acknowledge that oppressors and the oppressed alike are tainted by sin, and that power shifts alone do not solve social inequalities. In other words, oftentimes, even if there is a revolution, the oppressed eventually become oppressors themselves. Symbolic interactionism, again, is a more benign theory, but it looks at social problems through the lens of ascribed meaning and how those meanings shape social problems and how those problems are communicated. From a Christian view, we would certainly agree that symbols and language are inherent to the imago Dei, that is, being made in God's image, but again are distorted by the stain of sin. We would also note from a Christian perspective that spiritual insights, that is what we call revelation, are also possible, and that those insights can transcend language. Social constructionism looks at social problems through the lens of social or societal beliefs shaping perceptions of problems. That is, our understanding of those problems are socially constructed. As Christians, we would agree that cultural diversity is an expression, once again, of being made in God's image. But culture, human culture, is also distorted by sin. There are some aspects of human culture that reflect us being made in God's divine image, and there are some aspects of human culture that reflect us being distorted by sin. And we would agree that some ideas certainly may be socially constructed, but we also believe that there are some transcendent truths that are revealed. Finally, postmodernism looks at social problems through the lens of social norms, which are power structures. And if those are power structures, then they must be dismantled. From a Christian view, we agree that some social norms are harmful and they dehumanize people, and perhaps they should be deconstructed and addressed. But some social norms humanize and uphold people and uphold the dignity of human nature. So we would also say that perceptions may be relative or subjective in the human experience, but for us, from a faith-based perspective, truth ultimately is not. All of these theories can be summarized in this simple Venn diagram illustrating the is versus the ought in sociology. On one hand, sociology attempts to understand what is in society. In other words, just trying to, as much as we can, objectively describe the situation or diagnose the problem. And we use social science methodology to do that. But the other side of sociology is prescribing what ought to be in society. That is, responding to the social problems with some kind of proposed solution. So on the is side of the diagram, we have symbolic interactionism and social constructionism, which by and large are really theoretical tools to help us understand the nature of social problems and social dynamics. Symbolic interactionism focuses on communication, and social constructionism focuses on epistemology. However, when looking at the ought of what should be in society, we're making value judgments. We're prescribing the way we think society ought to be. And it's in this area that sociologists must be very careful, because all value judgments come from some ideological base. Now, if we're honest as Christians who are doing sociology, we can be very upfront about what our inherent biases are informed by our faith tradition. That's part of being a good scholar, a good academic, and a good researcher, is acknowledging those biases up front. But when we use various sociological theories to inform our research, we also must understand what the value judgments are that inform those theories themselves. So for structural functionalism, the driving value is social stability or equilibrium. For conflict or critical theory, the driving force is social justice. And for postmodernism, the driving value is deconstruction. So if we understand what these three theories are aiming for in their approach to social problems, and we understand on the is side of the diagram what symbolic interactionism and social constructionism are aiming to help us uncover or reveal about the nature of social problems, we have a much more sober and holistic understanding of sociology itself, especially as we aim to integrate these theories not only with each other, but also with our Christian faith. And I think where the is and the ought overlap in this Venn diagram is precisely the kind of work that we do at OGS. Russell Heddendorf was a well-known Christian sociologist who taught at Covenant College in Chattanooga, just south of the hometown of Omega Graduate School in Dayton, Tennessee. And currently, Dr. Matt Voss also teaches in the sociology department at Covenant College. Both have served on the faculty at OGS. Dr. Heddendorf before his death, and Dr. Voss, who has taught for us over the years and continues to be involved at OGS in a tangential way. Dr. Heddendorf wrote the book Hidden Threads, a Christian critique of sociological theory, which we strongly recommend as students at OGS work on their dissertations and research projects. Dr. Voss then contributed and edited an updated volume, adding a critique of postmodernism later after Dr. Heddendorf passed away. The basic points that Heddendorf and Voss make are that we must, as Christian sociologists, do our very best to reject ideological bias and political orthodoxies. Ultimately, we're all going to have them, just as we would disclose our Christian faith as a bias in the research process, or the driving values judgments that each of the sociological theories bring. But we should not assume that our Christian faith forces us into a political box, conservative versus liberal, left versus right, so on and so forth, because that's incredibly small-minded compared to the history of Christianity over the past 2,000 years and a global perspective of Christianity outside of the United States of America and our rather constricting boundaries of time and place and culture. Our founder, Dr. Hollis Green, used to often say we should not look at the world through a straw. And what he means by that is so often we can only see issues through our very limited vantage point in our present culture and time. And that's partially what Peter Berger means by socially constructed knowledge, is that we can't help but have some of our perspectives informed by our present situation. But if we want to do good sociology as Christians, we must work hard to reject ideological bias and political orthodoxies, because those are fleeting and they are temporary. And aligning with them keeps us merely blowing in the wind. We should aim for something that grounds us much deeper. And we can do that by evaluating social theories against a Christian meta-narrative. And for us, that's the creation, fall, redemption, transformation narrative. God created, the creation is broken, Christ redeems it, and ultimately God will transform it into a new heavens and a new earth. And that meta-narrative helps us transcend the political ideologies of the day. We should be especially sensitive to scientific claims that align with biblical principles. That is, if we're going to be good social scientists, we need to have an appreciation and understanding of the integration of Christian thought and science as an empirical method. And finally, we must acknowledge human limitations in understanding the social world and emphasize the need for Christian humility in all sociological pursuits. We are also broken vessels, and despite our best efforts of applying sociological theory critically, bringing our faith to bear on our research, and maybe even using time-tested social science methodology, gathering empirical data, validating instruments, testing hypotheses with statistical procedures, our findings will always fall short, because we are broken human beings and we're trying to understand a broken social world in a broken and sin-stained creation. So if we can approach our work with humility, we will be all the better for it, both in terms of sharing it with others and with the broader academic world. We must bring humility to bear on our sociological work because, quite simply, Christians get it wrong, and we have gotten it wrong throughout all of history. And this just illustrates the point that we are broken. Some examples of this are things like ecclesial corruption in medieval social order. For centuries in medieval Europe, the church upheld and protected the aristocracy and was largely complicit with an elite class, while peasants suffered under that structure of feudal system. And it really wasn't until the French Revolution that that was upended, perhaps too violently, but it was upended. The church has mistreated indigenous peoples throughout history, particularly in the 19th century during the scramble for land in Africa and the colonial conquests. And many times indigenous peoples were converted by threat of force, and oftentimes suffered greatly at the hands of Christians who thought they were doing God's work. Of course, one of the biggest examples here in the United States is Christian justification of slavery versus abolitionism. Throughout the history of slavery in the United States, many Christians justified the practice even by trying to cite scripture to do so. And until Christians began to champion the cause of abolitionism, there was not widespread understanding within the church that Africans are full human beings and deserve full human rights. And so the church quite simply got it wrong. And to be clear, not all Christians, but certainly the church writ large got it wrong until the system was abolished and there was ultimately full civil rights in the 1960s. And to this day, the church continues to get it wrong in many ways. The church in America is still quite segregated. Racism still occurs and abounds. And so in many ways, the church has much work to do in this area, particularly in the U.S. The church has also gotten it wrong in terms of gender equality, coming to the point of supporting females as full citizens with the right to vote in a democracy, which didn't occur until into the 20th century in America. Of course, another example is Nazism and anti-Semitism, where the church in Germany were complicit in the genocide of the Jewish people. And martyrs like Dietrich Bonhoeffer gave their life to stand up against that when it was not the popular thing to do. And all of these examples are not here to make us necessarily feel guilty, although we should feel repentant and contrite, I think. They're here to illustrate why we have to be careful and why we have to be humble in the kinds of work that we do in sociological research. The is much safer than the ought. And so when we prescribe an ought, we must do so with the utmost humility, because like Christians throughout history, we might be getting it wrong. There are four main reasons why Christian humility is so important in sociological research. First, we have to recognize that we have a limited perspective. Christians, like all individuals, have socially situated perspectives. We have to acknowledge that this prevents the assumption that our present viewpoint in this time, in this place, in our culture is absolute. It is not. Number two, we have to remain open to diverse views. Humility allows us to be open to and learn from different sociological perspectives, even if we might disagree with them. And that openness helps shape and hue our own perspectives. Number three, we must avoid dogmatism, or as I said earlier, ideologies. Humility in sociology helps us avoid dogmatic, and that's political, ideological, and sometimes even theological approaches to doing the work of sociology, which hopefully can help us be more exploratory and empathetic in understanding the social problems that we are researching. And finally, we must approach all the work that we do in sociology, especially working with human participants ethically. And a humble spirit encourages ethical sociological research. When Dr. Michael Lloyd, principal at Wycliffe Hall at the University of Oxford, was the commencement speaker for Omega Graduate School, he gave us a framework, or what I like to call a posture, for Christian scholarship. And quite simply, he said that Christian scholars must be both open and critical. That is, we have to be open to new ideas, even if they make us uncomfortable, but always critical of them at the same time. And existing in that state of tension, of being both open and critical, allows us to grow as Christian scholars and to maintain a posture of humility. And I think this works very well for Christian sociologists because oftentimes we're dealing with sociological theories that make us uncomfortable. We're dealing with social problems that are complex and nuanced. And at the same time, we're trying to bring our faith to bear on the issue. So if we can remain open to new ideas, and perhaps even open to criticism ourselves, then we can maintain that posture of humility that's so important in sociological research. Finally, I would challenge aspiring sociologists, especially those coming at sociology and sociological theory from a Christian perspective, to start by looking in the mirror. It's far easier to level sociological critique to a secular or non-Christian culture, but it takes far more courage and humility to prophetically critique Christian subcultures. And my challenge is to start there. Start by looking in the mirror and questioning what Christian subcultures are doing and how they're presenting and how they're addressing social problems. Because then at least we have, as symbolic interactionists would say, the language that we can use to speak to those subcultures and perhaps help them to nudge closer to a kingdom vision of the ought in sociological terms. And I'll end with this scripture from the Apostle Paul writing to the Corinthians. What business is it of mine to judge those outside of the church? Are you not to judge those inside? God will judge those outside. And I think what we can glean from this example is to start by looking in the mirror as Christian sociologists. It's easy to throw stones at a broken and sinful world all around us. It's much harder to do the work of self-examination.